precisely, that there's not something that you missed. It's sort of like, even though when you write, you know grammar and you know spelling, but you don't rely on your own abilities. You look at the grammar check and the spelling check that's built into Word, for example, because they're going to pick up on stuff that you might miss. Words that you just slip your mind about how to spell, or violations of grammatical rules that you weren't aware of, or whatever. Same sort of thing here. This looks at your page in a very thorough way and looks for any violations of the rules. Why are the violations of the rules important? Well, we talked about, a long time ago, we talked about what happens when you break the rules in HTML. And the answer was, it kind of depends. It kind of depends how you break the rule. All right? Not all of the rule violations are going to have the same consequences. In other words, your page may look good, at least on some browsers, even if you violate some of the rules of HTML. But the idea here is that if you follow the rules correctly, you've increased your chances of having your pages look good now and in the future on any new browsers that are developed, as well as any current ones, as well as any current ones that are out there. So by following the rules precisely, you maximize your chances. That's a good check. In addition, there are devices other than web browsers that access your page. There are crawlers. In other words, Google search engine crawls the web. It's not like they have someone sitting at a desk surfing the web on a browser or writing down all the web pages that they find, right? There's a program that goes out and looks for web pages and creates an index of them. If your page follows the rules of HTML precisely, then the crawler can do a better job indexing your page. In addition, for people with disabilities, there are different forms of assistive technology. For example, screen readers, software that actually narrates the page to you. All right? So for all these reasons, the more that you follow the rules exactly, ultimately the better off you're going to be. That doesn't mean that the page is going to be perfectly viewed across all browsers. Remember, we talked about that. You can follow the rules correctly, and still there could be a problem in the browser. Why? Well, because browser makers are humans just like we are, and they make mistakes. And there's bugs in browsers that didn't get caught through testing. In addition, the standard sort of evolves while people making browsers are putting out new releases of browsers. So the HTML5 specifications might not be finalized when people made a certain browser, and therefore it doesn't implement all the features in HTML5. Browser makers are sort of going up against a moving target sometimes as new things are added into the language. So for all these reasons, validating your page is like a good first step, but it's not the only step. Ideally, you would still test your page across different browsers, and if you have the resources available, across different versions of each browser. Now, the good news is that browsers are free, so you could download to your machine, your laptop, or whatever. You could download any number of browsers: Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome. There's an Opera browser. If you run a Mac, there's Safari, and so on. You can download them. If you work at a place, you can have a lab set up where you keep older versions of the browsers as well, so you can test based on those. So let's look at the Validator in more detail, because it takes a little practice to be able to understand the different error messages that are produced by the Validator. I'm going to pull down the stuff that we have been working on lately. Ah, that's not the one I want. I do regret I did not have a recording of last Wednesday's class. You can view the examples, though. So let's look at this first prototype that we developed. All right. We're going to go and we are going to open this up and we're going to copy and paste the code and we're going to paste it into the validator. Where is the validator located? It's located at w3c.org. That's the name of the organization that is responsible for developing all the web standards. And you see there's a lot of things that they have, a lot of resources and links that they have. But one of their most popular one, if you look over on the side for developers, is they have a Validators. There are actually validators for HTML and CSS. So in this example, we are looking at just the validation of HTML. We could put in a website, we can upload a file, or we can just direct input our code into that box. And if I run check, all right, I have only 2 warnings. These are the warnings that we saw last time. So I'm going to fix these so I get a perfect record on my evaluation here. But then I'm going to go and deliberately mess things up. All right, I'm going to deliberately mess up some things so that we can see the errors. It tells me that I should have the language attribute on the HTML tag. So I should have in there lang equals en. All right. It assumes that, but it's a good idea to put that in. All right. So notice it's a default, or it's a warning. It's not an error. It's not telling me I really violated the language. It's telling me, yeah, you might want to look at this. Also, it's telling me that consider the H1 as a top level headings. So therefore, they're saying make the rest of these H2s. And again, that's just a warning. But I'm going to go and follow that, if for no other reason, so I can clear out all my errors. And when I check it again, no errors or warnings. All right, so I did everything the way that I should. So let me go copy this. And we'll put that back in here. Now I'm going to break some rules. All right. Wow, we're gonna, you know, be born to be wild here and break some rules. All right. I'm going to get rid of my end header tag. All right. So I got rid of my end header tag. And I'm going to select everything, and I'm going to paste it in here. Now, it would be nice if it said, hey, you forgot the end header tag. All right? But remember, this is not a person that you're talking to. This is not a human. This is a computer program that's giving you these error messages. And therefore, the logic by which it comes up with error messages and the way that it describes the error messages is sort of different than you would as a person. For one thing, if I notice, I actually got 3 errors here. All right? I have 3 errors here. And we'll look at each of them, and we know what we did wrong. So we'll be able to make sense out of them. But remember, when you're actually validating your code, you have no idea what's wrong with your code, so you have to be able to interpret these. So take your best shot at interpreting it, and if you can't figure it out, let me know, and I'll give you a hand with it. So first of all, it says the element footer must not appear as a descendant of the header element. Can someone translate that into more? Yeah, you can't have a footer inside of a header. And because we have no end header tag, the footer is actually considered to be part of the header. All right? So it's a weird way to say it, but if you think about it, it really does make sense. It says we've hit the end tag for body, but there were unclosed elements. Well, that one makes sense. We didn't have the end header tag yet. In other words, we started the header tag way up here, and we hit the end body. Everything ought to be closed by now, right? Because the body contains everything, or most things. And yet we hit the end body and we hit the end header. And then finally, the last error tells us the real problem. Unclosed element header. All right? So in that case, it's pretty obvious what it is. Don't be alarmed if you get a lot of errors, because as we can see here, one small problem can actually show up as several different errors. So you might have a listing of 15 different errors. There may only be 3 or 4 things that are wrong on your page. All right, so don't panic if you see a bunch of errors. Let's try something else. Let's put the title in the wrong place. All right, the title is inside the body, where we know the title should be inside the head. Well, we get 2 errors, and these are actually pretty obvious. Element head is missing a required instance of child element title. Whenever you see an error message like that, it's telling you that you need to have a title inside the head. And then down at error number 2, it says element title is not allowed as a child of body. So you can't have the title in the body. You have to have the title in the head. Let's say we spell a tag name incorrectly. All right, we typoed, we typed in header. It tells us element header is not allowed as a child element of body. All right? In other words, it's not ever expecting to see a tag called header inside the body. So, pardon me? Yes, on purpose. I'm making errors on purpose so that we can see the error messages that we get. Then it's telling us that we have a stray end tag for header, right? In other words, what it's telling us is, hey, I don't know what this is, but it's not supposed to be here. And it's telling us, hey, I have an ending tag without a matching start tag because the start tag is spelled wrong. Then it says end of body seen, but there were unclosed elements. So even though it knows this is an invalid tag, it's still expecting to see an end tag for it, all right, which is kind of odd. And then it tells us, hey, you don't have an end tag for header with 2 R's. And then you fix it, all right? So again, the takeaway, I guess, from this is, number 1, run your page through the validator, all right? That won't guarantee it's going to be browser compatible, but it is a step in the right direction. It'll help you make sure your page, now and going forward, has the best chance. In other words, if there's a problem with the page, at least you know it isn't your fault, all right? Now, that really doesn't count for a lot, because if there's a problem with your page, guess what? You still have to fix it, right? Because if there's a bug in Internet Explorer or in Chrome or in Firefox or whatever, it's still your page, and you have to make it work correctly with the browsers. But it is useful to know that going forward, you follow the rules, and that's a good assurance that there's a good chance that everything will display correctly across different browsers. You still have to test it. So test your page through this. Remember that one mistake can actually show up as several different kinds of errors. And finally, remember that the errors are worded in such a way that can be a little confusing. You have to take a little bit of time to read and interpret it. Now, there's also a validator for your CSS, where the same kind of rules apply. Let's see. All right, CSS Stylesheets. And it works just about the same. So I can go in here and open up my style sheet. And validate it. And congratulations, no errors found. Same idea, what would be an error? Well, if a classic error that people have is they spell, and I even do it sometimes, they spell background wrong. They forget the G, background. And it'll tell you, hey, I don't know what a background is. And it tells you, hey, maybe you mean background image. This is useful if you're debugging your CSS, right? So one thing that I say in all my classes is that it's useful to have some tools to help you figure out what's going wrong instead of just staring at the code. All right? So if I did something like this, let's say, I'll make the mistake deliberately and I'll make it font family. All right? I got rid of the dash. If I go and view this page, I may wonder say I do it everywhere on the page. All right. If I notice I'm not getting the fonts that I want on the page because I spelled font family wrong in all these places. Sometimes if you look at it, you'll say, hey, oh, okay, I forgot the dash or whatever. It's actually nice because if you notice in Notepad++, notice how font family looks a little different than this. It's because it doesn't recognize it. But let's say you didn't notice that. Rather than sitting here staring at this forever, saying, I don't know why I don't have the right fonts. Let me look at this. And you stare at it. Rather than doing that, if you run this page through the validator, it'll give you some good hints as to what's probably wrong. So in this case, it tells us, well, you have 3 errors. Font family doesn't exist. You probably mean font dash family. So this is a valuable tool in debugging. The same thing is true with your HTML page as well. If some things don't show up exactly the way that you want, you can run it through the validator. But I find it especially useful for your CSS. So from now on, be sure to run your pages through the validator, both your CSS and your HTML. Now, that doesn't mean that your page is a well-designed page if it passes a validator. Any more that you could run your page through spell check and have all your words spelled correctly and still write not a very good paper, right? You just spelled everything right. Your poor paper shows good spelling. Well, same thing here. You could have a poorly designed web page with bad content, it doesn't look right or whatever, but you follow the rules of the language. So it's not the only thing to consider when evaluating the page, but it is something to consider. All right, any questions here? All right, the next thing that we're going to talk about is developing for mobile devices. All right? It's a much bigger issue than it used to be in the past. All right? Simply because as time has gone on, people use their mobile devices more and more, and people use desktop computers less and less. All right? So being able to access a web page on a mobile device is really a big deal. It's really something important. So we want to be able to make our web pages look good regardless on the device that it is being viewed on. All right? Some of the differences between a mobile device and a desktop computer. First of all, the screen obviously is going to be physically much smaller. All right? Even if you compare a tablet, it would take a pretty big tablet to be as big as a typical computer screen. Never mind the really big computer screens. All right? Now, some of the tablets might be around the size of a laptop screen. But most phones are going to be far smaller than a laptop or a computer screen. That means that there's going to be issues making it hard to read. There's going to be issues navigating because it's harder to hit a very precise point on your phone with your finger than it is when you view the page when you use a mouse to click on things. By the way, I just realized I did not show the computer for the first part of the lecture. So if you want to do what I did in the example, I went to w3c.org. I went to the Validators, and I pasted the contents of a web page in here. And you can see there's no errors or warnings. Then I did the same thing with the CSS validator. I do apologize for that. I just happened to look up and see the monitor and see that I was not showing the computer. So that's what I was doing. Okay. A mobile screen is going to be smaller, which means it's harder to click a link, for example. With a mouse, it is pretty easy to go and click even a small spot on the screen. But if the links are spaced too close together on a mobile version of it, it can be actually very hard to go with your finger. And there's a lot of times on poorly designed websites, I try to click one link and I end up clicking another link. All right, simply because I have big fingers, and if I'm not careful, I can click on the wrong thing. We can emulate what it's going to look like on a mobile device simply by going in Google Chrome under More Tools, Developer Tools, and then we can pick up here the device, and we can emulate certain devices. This is what it would look like on a Pixel 2. Let's compare it side by side. Elsie's website actually comes off looking pretty good in a situation like this. All right? Notice that the navigation is different. All right? That we don't have those links up there. We have this kind of navigation. Which doesn't seem to do very good. Oh. Ooh. I wonder if it's like that on an actual mobile device or the emulator. Sometimes there's issues with the emulator. But if you notice that the mobile version of the device, of the thing, sort of takes multiple columns and changes everything into a single column. Oftentimes with a CSS, you can actually get rid of some content. It works better? Yeah, it works better. That was an issue with the emulator. That's good to see. All right. The point is it's not going to look exactly the same on a mobile device as compared to a desktop device. And that's okay. That's good. All right. We want a page to work well both in a mobile and a desktop environment, but it doesn't have to work identically. So we can do things. Another thing that is a characteristic is people access a page on a mobile device. Sometimes they're looking for different kinds of information. If you were sitting down and researching something about what courses you needed to take to get a degree in computer software development, that might be something that you want to sit down with a desktop computer and figure out. On the other hand, if you were running errands and you wanted to see, gee, how late is the library open today? That might be something that you'd be more apt to look up on a mobile device. Very pointed queries. So mobile devices look different. They have different dimensions. Users interact with them differently. And what's more, users have different goals for accessing mobile devices than they do accessing a desktop page. So because of that, all right, we're going to do our best to make pages that work well both in a desktop environment and in a mobile environment. All right. Typically, the mobile development, the mobile version is going to be simpler, maybe less content, maybe simpler interactions. All right. So, how do we do that? One way we do that is through what is called responsive web development. Let's look up responsive web development and see what that means. I say there's an article I really like here. We'll pick this one. Maybe this isn't the article that I was looking for. The idea of responsive development, first of all, is that a web page should look good on any device. Okay, I'll just come up with my own list. So a big point of the whole idea of responsive web development is that web page looks good on any device. That's sort of the main principle of responsive design. Now notice it doesn't say that the web page is going to look identical on every device. That's an unrealistic goal. Someone that has a big, gigantic monitor, I wouldn't expect a website to look the same on that on my normal-sized phone, all right, or a small phone. But it should look good in both cases. All right, so when I say it needs to look good, I don't mean that it's going to look identical. All right? In other words, the page is going to respond to how it's being viewed. That's sort of the key of responsive web design. Now, what are some of the characteristics of that? We are going to use percentages for most everything. All right? In particular for widths, we're not or we're rarely going to do, say, something like a width of 400 pixels. Instead, we're going to say a width of 40% maybe, or 35%, or something like that. So our widths are going to be in percentages rather than pixels. Already we can see that that makes the page responsive, right? Because as the page gets bigger or smaller, or as the window gets bigger or smaller, the width of that gets bigger or smaller. Now, We might use minimum widths and maximum widths. But our basic width is going to be expressed in a percent. We might do this in terms of pixels. But the basic width is going to be in a percentage. Now, when I say for most everything, I don't just mean for sections of the page, like, for example, the header, the nav, sections, footer. I mean even images. So here's an example of, we'll go back and talk about Viewport in a second. The width, the image is set to be 100%. By the way, they're using a different technique to assign a style. This is called an inline style, and I hate it. All right, so I would never, never, ever, ever, ever use it. What I would do would be something like this. I would put it in the style tag. Ideally, I'd put it in an external style file. But I would say image with 100%. And again, what does it mean when we say 100%? It means 100% of the available space. So if I make this 40%, it's 40% of the available space. And as it gets bigger or smaller, that image gets bigger or smaller. Now, how does a maximum? Oh, and they also suggest using a height of auto, which you really don't have to do because the auto is the default. If you set max width properties up is set to 100%, the image will scale down, but it will never scale up. What that means is you don't want to scale an image bigger than its actual size. So if you have a 200 pixel image, you don't want to make that image 800 pixels wide. Otherwise, you're going to lose quality of the image, and it's going to be distorted. So you can use the maximum width on that and specify the maximum width, and then it will get no bigger than its actual size. Another thing they talk about that we skipped, that we'll come to now, is the viewport. The viewport gives the browser instructions on how to control the page's dimension and scaling. And if we look at this page, if we and in this case, it didn't really do anything. But on mobile devices, the viewport can have an impact on it. Let's go to my example here. And let me put that viewport command in. Let's see. Let's see what it said. How to control the page's dimensions and scaling. So here's my web page without the viewport in there. I'm having a heck of a time with this. And if I go to a mobile view and I pick a pixel 2, it looks like this. If I put the mobile or the viewpoint in here, and then view it, notice how it looks a lot better because it fills more of the space. Okay. Now this still doesn't look great, but it looks better than it did without the viewport. So it's a start. Now the last thing that we're going to have is something called a media query. A media query is where you tell the browser that this style sheet doesn't always apply. It applies under certain circumstances. Okay? You may have already seen media queries or seen the results of media queries if you ever go to print a web page. So let's say you pull up an article on a website, and that website might have ads in it, and it might have graphics, and might have all kinds of extra stuff. And if you go to print the page, the printing looks different. The printed version looks different than the completed page. All right? What they have is they actually have a second style sheet that they use, and they say, use this style sheet when you're displaying the page, use this style sheet when you're printing it out. Let's try to find an example of that. Let's go to let's go like to the Wall Street Journal. I'll bet they have one. So let's just pick a news article. Let's try to pick a non-controversial news article so we don't argue. Yeah. Okay, Marvel movies. Yeah, there we go. It is an article. Here we're viewing it on the screen. I guess this is still controversial, but at least it's not as controversial as it could be. It's not political, yeah. So if I go and print this page, there's a preview of it eventually. All right. Notice how it looks different. All right. What do we notice? We notice that this is aggravating me. Thanks. You're absolutely right. Press forward. I'm going to open up in 2 windows so that we can see it. Okay, here's the print preview. What do we notice right off the bat? We're missing the navigation on the top. Do you need navigation on a printed copy of the page? No, because you're not going to click on the link on a piece of paper, right? So it really doesn't do you any good if it's printed. Do I need a video on it? No, because I'm not going to watch a video on a printed copy of the page, and so on. it even was nice enough to get rid of the ads for us. So I probably should have clicked on to view the full story, but again, it's the same content, it's just formatted differently. And that is done by applying a different style sheet. Remember, we talked about style sheets, and you even had exercises where you had to make your pages look really different by having two different style sheets. Well, media queries are a way for you to have two style sheets on one page, and you can write a little snippet of code that allows the browser to choose between which style sheet to apply. All right? That's what we'll pick up next time. All right? It's the cliffhanger for the weekend. All right? You could read ahead if you want to. All right? If you want a spoiler, or you could wait until Monday. And Monday we'll talk about how we could put multiple style sheets on the page and allow the browser to pick which style sheets apply and which style sheets don't apply. Now here's a spoiler alert. More than one style sheet file can apply to a given page. All right? So if I have two style sheet files, maybe both of them apply to a page. Or maybe I have code that makes sure that sometimes two apply, sometimes one apply. So we'll pick up on that next week and finish this discussion on responsive design. All right, we'll see you up in lab.